Welcome to Global Lens. Today, we're diving into one of the most remarkable and fascinating political stories of this year, Zohran Mamdani's historic win in the New York City Democratic mayoral primary. Based on an Emerson College poll conducted in early February, he was only polling at 1%. Joining me today is my colleague and respected economic sociologist, Doug Guthrie, to unpack this groundbreaking moment. Doug, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Christine. This is such an important topic, and I can't wait to get into the details with you.
Thanks. Zohran Mamdani is just 33 years old and has already shaken the political landscape in New York. Let's talk about his winning strategy. He focused on affordability, issues that directly affects people's daily life, like rent control and cost of groceries. And New York is like many US cities, large US cities. The winner of the Democratic primary is likely the winner in the general election. What sets him apart is the ability to engage two key groups, the disaffected Trump voters and zero prime voters, those who rarely, if ever, turn out for elections. How do you manage to unite such a diverse and often divided electorate? Doug?
Well, I mean, it's a great question and a great topic, Christine. I mean, at our in our conversations, we like to talk about deep, important leadership questions, and this is an important leadership question, and it's an important political question for the United States, but it's also just a wild situation. I mean, this guy's 33 years old. He's been assemblyman in New York for a couple of years, but he's a kid. I mean, he's very young, and so this is a really important time to be thinking about who's going to be the next mayor of New York. And so, how did he do this? Well, he spent a significant amount of times in Queens and the Bronx, listening to the concerns of people rather than lecturing. And so he's very charismatic. I mean, for those who have seen him interact with people, he's very good at just listening and not lecturing. And so it's impressive. Um, he visited mosques and other community hubs, drawing in Muslim, South Asian, and immigrant voters who saw their struggles and aspirations reflected in his own story, right? So he was very good at sort of the charismatic politician thing of connecting with his voters and sort of using his difference not as something that he had to hide behind, but or hide away, but actually to connect with people. And it was very impressive to watch him. And he presented a dynamic alternative, walking across Manhattan and chatting up everybody. He was a social media genius, and he deployed a man of the campaign. He asked everybody to call him Zoran, which I think was really, interesting because again, he was just not being a politician who was having a different position, and sort of, but really being a person of the people. And he did it really, really well. And he was a great at the campaigning and great at just being a man of the people politician.
I love what you said about he's a social media genius. It turned out the median social media is new, but walking around at 1 a.m. in neighborhoods, shaking people's hands, people want to take selfie with him. That is retail politics. His approach to Trump supporters seemed especially unconventional for a democratic socialist. Doug, any take on that?
Well, and here again, like this is one of the things. You're right. I was sort of a little glib when I said social media genius because yeah, he was really good at being a young person using the media, but he did a very nice job of mixing, person of the people, walking out and talking to the people, and then filming those things and then presenting them out to people. So he did a nice job at merging being in and of the people and out on the streets, but then using social media to actually capture what he was doing. So he wasn't just doing media marketing campaigns, he was doing both. Um, and, in this period, like, it's really important. He focused on economic issues, and he was really focused on bridging ideological divides. And in this process, he won over Trump supporters. And, you know, it's remarkable because I think, there are other people in this group that were, sort of identify as democratic socialists and were sort of thinking with similar kinds of ideas, but he was the one that was able to connect and win over the Trump supporters. And so it's a remarkable story. I'm really impressed.
Yeah, if you look at some of the neighborhood that voted overwhelmingly for Trump, he was able to win in those districts. So his platform is quite ambitious. $30 minimum wage by 2030, rent control and affordability are the central pillars. But surely these proposals are drawing resistance.
Well, yeah. And, we have to sort of break these things down. Some of them are sort of symbolic things, and some of them are big idea things that are, a decade away or however they might. But he's talking to audiences in ways that I think other Democratic politicians just haven't been able to. Right? And so when you talk about things like the $30 minimum wage or rent control or affordability, you're actually making a statement about what should be done to really think about the transformation of the US economy over the last 40 years. And so if we think about billionaires and business leaders, um, they've already started mobilizing against him. They argue that his policies would harm the city's economy. New York Democrats outside the city, such as New York Governor Kathy Hochul, um, they don't know how to respond to his election because Mamdani's socialism isn't a very good sell in upstate New York, right? And so, and Trump has also called him a communist and threatened to strip New York City of funding if he steps in the line. And so there's a lot of debate and concern over what he's actually doing. But and I think we need to go deeper a little bit when we get deeper in the conversation about like what do these issues like the $30 minimum wage mean and what are they symbolic about? But he's really kind of staking a claim and like putting a line in the sand and saying like, you know, we're in a society in which $7.25 minimum wage doesn't work in places like New York City, and we need to be talking about aggressively upping the ante for lower income people.
Before we go deeper, let's bring up the other candidate, Brad Lander, in this race, someone you know personally. And I saw him on Colbert's show with Mamdani. And in the choice rank voting, they encourage each other. They encourage the voters to vote to rank the number one and the other candidate number two to beat out the establishment Cuomo. So, how did his campaign differ from Mamdani's?
Well, and just to be clear, you mentioned it. I know Brad. Brad and I went to college together, and Brad was, in the same dorm that I was in as a freshman in Woodward Court at the University of Chicago, and we were in Amy Cass's Human Being and Citizen class, and um, in our first year. I mean, Brad. I think the world of Brad. I think he's a brilliant, brilliant person. He's, one of those people who's like, oh, that person may be one of the smartest people I've ever met. I mean, he's a brilliant person. And Brad, I've heard him identify as well as a democratic socialist. And so he's clearly got many similar ideas to Mamdani. Um, I was a little bit surprised by and impressed by Brad with the support because, Brad he's Jewish and he also I know he's thought very deeply about the issues of Israel in the world and Israel in the Middle East and but Brad is also just a brilliant person and a brilliant politician and I think he's able to see deeply into the core ideas and like find bridges to build and actually see what somebody's about and rather than paint them in sort of broad brushstrokes to really kind of deeply understand. And so, as the election was coming up, we saw them sort of debating and discussing about like, okay, well, since it's a ranking voting, like let's support each other. Like rather than having, a fight to the end, like let's get the right person to vote elected. And so I'm impressed with Brad. I think Brad is just, a brilliant person, as I always remember him being back when we were at the University of Chicago together, but he's also just a thoughtful person about like it's not about me getting elected, it's about the right person getting elected. And I'm impressed. I think Brad is just a really interesting, smart politician and person, and he's been controller of New York for several years, and it was my secret hope that he would be mayor, but But I also believe in Brad, and Brad has decided to support Mamdani, and so I think it's a really interesting time for leaders like Brad and Mamdani.
It must be so interesting to follow your friend in this crazy race. Well, let's talk about Mondani's youth. Well, his youth reminds me of President Obama. Mondani is charismatic, like you said. He's more openly critical of the establishment, including Obama himself, as seeing his past critique Obama's handling of surveillance issues. But one of the knocks against him is not really his youth, but his lack of knowledge. You mentioned that he was only a two-term state assemblyman. And I saw one of the newspaper articles saying that he has the thinnest, the lightest resume. So he really lacks how much institutional knowledge could a young assembly person have about the inner workings of a complex and multifaceted New York City?
Well, it's a great question, and I think we need to think deeply about this because I think, as much as we like to think politicians are just, you know, smart, brilliant, door-knocking people who get into the mix and get people excited and riled up, it's also a job. If you become mayor of New York City, it's a big job. Like you got to run the city, and although he's been assemblyman for 2 terms, you know, this is still a big thing to do. And so, to answer your question, I don't know how much he knows about the inner workings of a complex and multifaceted city like New York, but my guess is, he's pretty young and pretty inexperienced, so he probably doesn't know a lot. Now, this is why it's going to be really important that he has allies in people like Brad Lander as the comptroller, right? And so, like, he needs to know people and rely on people and have friends that are in the workings of things and not just be somebody who got elected because he was the sort of charismatic naysayer and door knocker on things. He actually needs to get up and do the work. And so my guess is, to answer your question, he probably doesn't know a lot about what it takes to be mayor, but he's going to have friends like Brad Lander. And, even he was endorsed by AOC, and he's
Yes. Bernie,
kind
I
of
think. Yeah,
and Bernie Sanders, like he's going to be need to rely. I mean, New York is a really important city in America, and it's a really big city and a big job, and he's going to need to rely on people to help him do this work. But it seems that he's reaching out to people in ways that are going to make him effective at that. So I'm, just as I'm, of me as a China guy, but also a leadership professor, it seems like even at a pretty young age, he's doing a good job at being a leader and sort of reaching out to people. The fact that he was on Colbert with Brad Lander makes me think like, okay, so he's reaching out to people and they're going to be allies if he is so fortunate to get elected. And so it's
that's
going to be an
fant
interesting watch. Yeah.
that's fantastic. Well, let's talk about a sensitive subject. So, New York has the largest and most diverse Jewish population outside of Israel. In a city like this, he's been quite outspoken about Israeli Palestinian, what about Israel, and then his support for Palestine has really drawn both strong support and intense criticism. How has he managed this political tension?
Well, again, it's a great question, and again, I'm thankful that he is, getting people from the Democratic side of the House on his team, like Brad Lander, because it suggests to me that he's being reasonable, not just in front of the media, but also behind closed doors and talking to people. But yeah, so he's been openly critical about Israeli government policy, aligning himself with growing progressive movement that includes both Palestinian and Jewish voices. And that's an important thing because, again, he's been critical, but he's been working to align himself with both Palestinian and Jewish voices. So he's not just, it doesn't come across as just an anti Israeli and pro-Palestinian position. He's really trying to walk a fine line, and so I think it's interesting. His stance has drawn intense backlash from more conservative and traditional Jewish communities, particularly the neighborhoods like the Borough Park and Midwood. Um, but it also has resonated with younger Jewish voters who are disillusioned with unconditional support for Israel and want a shift in U.S. foreign policy. And so his ability to carry precincts with large Jewish populations shows a changing political landscape and his own charisma in articulating this position. And it's a changing political landscape that's less defined by ethnic blocks and more by ideology and generational identity. And Mondami's focus on shared economic hardship has helped depolarize the issue. He's emphasized solidarity over division. And it's really powerful. I mean, he's really good at it. And so it's impressive, but still, this remains a political fault line. If he wins in November, how he governs on this issue will be closely watched, especially given New York's symbolic importance in the American Jewish life. And so I just think he's really in an interesting position here. And he has a monumental task ahead of him. Um, you know, a legacy city the size of New York is complex and not easily mastered. He does want to fix a lot of things, and there won't be easy solutions, right? And so he's got to think about how to reform the New York Police Department, which has 50,000 employees and an annual budget of 5.4 billion. He's got to think about how to fix the New York City subway, the second largest in the world with 472 stations and 2 billion riders annually. And these are just two important issues and elements in the city. And and there are many more, but does he have the institutional knowledge to lead those efforts? It's hard to know at this point. And again, it's going to really be dependent on his ability to reach out and be friends with Comptroller Brad Lander and other players that are major figures in the city and national politics. And so it's going to be interesting to watch.
I love what you said about this remaining a political fault line because there's a common rule of thumb we call no one gets elected to political office in the United States without aligning with Israel. And this is changing. That used to be a rule, a hard rule. And he's potentially changing that and winning over the younger Jewish voters. Well, let's talk about Mandani's rise. I found it really interesting. As a country, we elected President Donald Trump, MAGA, and then now in New York, we're about to elect Mondani. Is his rise and reaction to Donald Trump's election win?
Well, it's a great question. And you know, this is part of a pendulum swing from MAGA to progressive populism. But I want to make the case that these two things sort of fit together. Now, on the one hand, you know, maybe this is a uniquely New York phenomenon. We are sitting here at an intersection between diverse communities and that are demanding leadership that understands their lived lives. But it's also a really important moment. And I just to be, I don't want to be too political in taking sides in this debate, but I think the Democrats have been extremely poor, going back to Harris in the general election, at articulating what the real issues are. So one of the things that's made MAGA so powerful is that, President Trump tapped into some of the real economic hardship and economic pain that American people have been feeling. And you and I have talked about this many times, but I always like to cite this not just as a recent thing. This goes back 46 years to Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan. We might blame corporations for going global, but we invited them to go global. Neoclassical economic theory under Milton Friedman, who was Ronald Reagan's main economic advisor, opened the doors and said, Apple, GM, Ford, go to China because labor's cheaper there. And China's building an immaculate manufacturing supply chain. Go. And so they did, and it was really good for shareholders, and it's made companies like Apple the most valuable company in the world. But people have been hurting in America. Now, we often don't see the hurt in America because America's economy is still the largest in the world, and we still have a lot of corporate profits coming in, and we still have a very powerful high-end manufacturing, no, not high-end manufacturing, but high-end service sector supply chain with organizations in fields like investment banking and accounting and consulting, and we do very well. And our joblessness rate is low, But a lot of those $40 an hour manufacturing jobs have been replaced by $7.25 minimum wage jobs at places like Walmart. And so, like we look at the statistics and say we still have the largest economy in the world and jobless rate is pretty good at 2.9%. So we're great. And we're not, because a lot of those families who used to have union jobs now have minimum wage jobs. And so when you hear Mamdani talking about things like, oh, and we're going to have a $30 minimum wage, he's speaking to those people. He's directly targeting them and talking to them about this is what we're going to do. And so like he's really he's really talking to MAGA voters, right? And so really thinking about progressive populism in economic terms. And so he's done a very powerful job at this, and I'm impressed. Like he's doing a really interesting dance, and it's impressive.
I think it could just be a campaign promise. $30 just seems unrealistic, even though he's targeting 5 years later.
Sure.
It's just if I'm a bakery, and I need to hire someone, $30 an hour is just incredibly high for a low mom and pop shop.
Well, it's a great point, Christine, and you're exactly right. This is just rhetoric because, like, yes, you could impose this kind of idea on, say, the Walmarts of the world and say you don't get to hire people for $7.25 an hour. You need to pay $30 an hour, and Walmart could handle it. But you're right that all of the small businesses, all of the mom and pop shops, the bakeries of the world, they would all go out of business. Like they can't handle this, and so like this is just rhetoric, except it's rhetoric that's targeting exactly the issue which Donald Trump has
Yes.
been targeting with the MAGites. And so like the key issue is like you all lost your $40 an hour union job. So Trump is like talking with the the hand of tariffs and saying like I'm going to force manufacturing jobs back to America, which you and I've discussed several times. Like it's sort of a ridiculous, facile argument about like how you would bring manufacturing back to America because it would take a lot of investment and a lot of time. But so Mamdani's doing a similar thing. He's like, using like a chalkboard and saying like $30 an hour. That's what you need, right? And so you're right. It's an unrealistic thing, but it is a way of targeting that population the same way that Donald Trump and JD Vance have been targeting that population. And so it's an interesting dynamic. It's really interesting to watch.
Yeah. So as a final thought, fast forwarding to November 4th of this year, and Mondavi does win the general election, what would his win signify for the future of American politics?
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is a great question. And again, this is important to watch. Is this just a flash in the pan one-time thing, or is this replicable? And before we suggest his campaign is replicable, we have to acknowledge that Mondami's most recognized competitor was Andrew Cuomo, who is one of the worst reputations in the political world after he resigned as the New York governor because of sexual harassment allegations,
Why
right? And
would you run again? That was so shocking, right? Like you
so
were a disgraced governor and then you go run for the mayor of the city. What makes you think you have the credibility? How does he even show up?
I agree with Christine. And, again, this is a little bit what's broken in American politics. And maybe it's why Mamdani won. It's because
But
people
why did
accepted.
Democratic machine even support that run?
Well, not only did the Democratic machine support that run, but Bill Clinton endorsed him. I mean, think
Oh
about
gosh.
that. Think about that, right? Here is a guy who was
Well, they both had
forced
sexual
out of office.
scandals.
Right. Here was a guy who was forced out of office because of sexual harassment allegations, and he's being endorsed by a guy who also has sexual harassment allegations.
Oh
Like
gosh.
to me, it's such a disappointment for like American leadership because you're just sort of like, really, guys? Like this is the best we can do. And so again, maybe the Mondamis and Brad Landers of the world are just like the next stage of like, hey, enough. Like, here's how this is going to happen. And so yes, Andrew Cuomo was in the background here, and it was just a disaster. But like to your question, why would he be running anyway? Is it just to to salvation for himself, or I mean, and because of all of that, Cuomo was a supremely weak opponent, and he thought his name ID would boost him into victory,
He is recognizable. His
and he
brother
is, of
was on
course.
CNN.
But this is a good lesson, and so maybe as much as I sometimes speak of feeling down about uh, the U.S. political system and what people's mindset are, like, people are also like sick of this. Like they're just like, okay, yeah, you were forced out of office because of sexual harassment issues. No, just because you have a good name, that's not enough, and that's a good lesson in politics. Failed leaders who are guilty of hubris and worse, they don't have an easy route back to office, and so.
But I
So
am a little worried. He's on the ballot as an independent. So I'm really worried that so he still has a name recognition. That didn't go away.
sure, but I think that I'm surprised that he's even staying on the ballot as an independent, because it just like this seems like such a slap from the voters. The fact that this wasn't just him losing in a tight race against some other candidate, it was him losing to a 33-year-old assemblyman. Like it
But
was
wouldn't the
clear.
billionaires and businessmen in New York want to defeat a democratic socialist? And wouldn't they then put their support behind an independent candidate just to defeat Mamdani? That's what I'm
Maybe,
worried about.
maybe, and that could happen, and I share your worry. But I guess again, the thing that was a very exciting thing for me to see in the final stages of the campaign, and you talked about Brad Lander and Mamdani appearing on Colbert in late June and sort of talking about these. It's clear that he's reaching out. Like it's clear that he's not just some, 33-year-old young person who's, a flash in the pan and really charismatic, but he's like thinking about how to organize. So my guess is he must also be reaching out to billionaires. Now, billionaires are going to be a little afraid of him because he identifies as a democratic socialist. But there are liberal billionaires in the world too that are not MAGAites, and they are, New York City is important to them. And if they think he's a powerful person and may get the electoral votes or the election votes, they're gonna work with him. And so what I like about him is it seems that he is serious about working with people. And so my hope is that he'll be reaching out to everybody. And
Well,
that's
I live on the West Coast. What I thought were progressive billionaires all attended the inauguration this year.
right.
So, um, pretty heartbroken about that. So, Doug, thank you so much for your insight.
I mean, Christine, this is such a great and important conversation for Global Lens, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. And so, thank you for preparing all these questions, and thanks for letting me talk a little bit about them. Thanks.
Well, that's it for our episode of Global Lens. Thank you so much, Doug. Well, once the primary results are certified this week, Mamdani will face the Republican and independent candidates in the fall. We'll be watching this race really closely over the next few months. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. Thank you. Goodbye.